Welcome to another podcast from Progressives for Immigration Reform. I'm your host, Kevin Lynn, and I have the distinct pleasure today to be with Paul Clark, author of Pandora's Green Box: Have Politics Concealed America's Greatest Environmental Issue and Threatened America's Way of Life? Paul, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Kevin.
Now, Paul, you're an environmental scientist. You have a master's degree in environmental science from Johns Hopkins University. You've toured the nation discussing issues of the environment, sustainability, preservation of wetlands, our water infrastructure. So it's a real pleasure to have you here today. Now, Paul, your book, one of the things you do get at, which you feel is pivotal, almost like a keystone topic when it comes to the environment, is population stabilization. How long have you been interested in the population, and when did you decide to write this book?
That's a great question. I guess it was a little bit when I was in high school. I grew up outside of the Baltimore, Washington metro area, and I noticed that quite a bit of the natural habitat that existed, sort of in the backyard, since I was on the fringe of the metro area, started to just become more developed and more developed over time. And I was wondering if there was ever an end to this. Is it, what is the end result here? Are we just going to be one big, massive suburb? And it got me a little bit interested in environmental issues, and I took a liking specifically to population growth as my key area of interest.
Interesting. So this is really high school time frame for you?
Yes, and naturally that led me to want to pursue a degree from my bachelor's in environmental science as a result.
Now, interesting enough, you have some great quotes in your book, and one of them is from the Democratic Senator Gaylord Nelson. Now, he was the founder of Earth Day, and he says, "In this country, it's phony to say I'm for the environment, but not for limiting immigration. It's just a fact, and we can't take all of the people who want to come here." It seemed to me, now, for those who don't know my story, I'm the son of an immigrant. My mother came here in 1952. At that time, we issued 178,000 green cards, and immigration was strictly enforced. And that was really coming from people who were probably left of center, who were really pushing for this kind of control on immigration. When did things start to change in your view, Paul? When did someone like a Senator Gaylord, who was the founder of Earth Day, when did his views on immigration become so unpopular on the left, or certainly maybe he just atrophied on the left?
The 1964-65 immigration bill most certainly had a big aspect of it.
So that was the Immigration Reform Act of 1965.
Yes. And more or less, as you probably, most people are aware, the big baby boom generation was the major driver of growth in the country, which was fertility rate from, during the late 40s and the 50s and the early 60s. And that started to drop off after the mid 60s. And because of the Immigration Reform Act, we began to see a greater number of immigrants coming to the country, which started to drive growth quite a bit. As you noted, in the 1950s, it was about 175,000. Today, we're nearly 1.5 million when you include undocumented immigrants as well. So that's a population the size of Philadelphia. So I think when Gaylord Nelson mentioned this quote, though, it was several years prior, and a lot of that had to do with actually the fact that the first Earth Day was based on population growth. It was based a little bit off Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb, which came out in 1969, which was a major book for the environmental movement, which emphasized the importance of population growth as an environmental factor when it came to many of the environmental issues we're facing. So,
and we seem to get it as a country culturally. I remember movies like the Omega Man. Soylent Green comes to mind with Charlton Heston, where they're living in a New York City that's vastly overpopulated, and resources are scant, and it's just not a nice place to be. And we seem to understand that, but it shifted. For instance, in your book, you talk about America's natural resources and the fact that a growing population places certain demands. For instance, you state, as America's natural resources result in greater utilization by a growing populace, economic factors may also be amplified. The classic supply versus demand economic concept has and will continue to be highly influenced by the relationship between the demands of population and availability of raw materials. Now, what specifically are those kinds of demands? You talked about them generally here. What would you say specifically? How would he see this manifest?
Well, good example is that each one of us live in a house, and that house is built from mostly timber, which requires a massive amount of lumber. Naturally, if you have millions and millions more people, that will have an impact on your forestry. Not to mention some of the minerals that we need to mine for our day-to-day lives, and one could also argue that the food production is a massive resource that we will most certainly have some concerns over when we look at our population looking to double again within this century. How do we feed all these people? The amount of land that would be required would most certainly likely increase as our yields per acre decrease. So these are all things that I think that play a factor as far as our resources. And I think beyond just that, we look at petroleum. Naturally, that's a major driver as well. And we have increased our imports as a result of that and relied on other people's resources because of our own population growth here. So our growth is not only impacting us, it is also impacting other regions of the world.
Right, because it seemed like in the early 1970s, we were able to pretty much stabilize the U.S. population, and that was with no coercion. Pretty much, obviously the educating of women and women entering the workforce was a factor in that.
Sure.
And we actually seem to be, from an environmental standpoint, trending in the right direction. But you had mentioned the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, and one of the things you had mentioned was a Pew Research article where almost 80%, actually 82% of the U.S. population growth is attributed to immigrants and the children of immigrants.
Definitely, that is definitely correct. And
so we saw this big spike after 1965
Yes.
in immigrants. Because for our listening audience, last year the U.S. issued roughly 1.2 million green cards, and that's legal immigrants.
Yes.
And we have a large number of illegal immigrants in the country now. So it really has, in many respects, become kind of unbridled. And we're certainly seeing that in the increase in the size of the population.
Well, certainly. I mean, the fact that you just said 1.2, and that's just legal immigrants. Great Britain, for example, has a population of 65 million people. So that's in anyone who's about 65 years of age. I mean, can you imagine within their lifetime, you're talking about 65 million more individuals. So all of that has an impact on certain things as far as our population growth, and it at one time, as you would see in the publication, growth in America from a domestic point of view was something that was very much so addressed, and the focus was on fertility. But unfortunately, as immigration started to be the main driver, we began to tiptoe away from that because of, unfortunately, political reasons.
Right. And what would you say some of those political reasons are?
Well, a lot of it is big money that wants the cheap labor. Naturally, that's a big part of it. A little bit of it also is individuals that see this new immigration groups that are coming to the country as a voting bloc that will help them to win future elections. So the environmental movement, unfortunately, during the 1990s, decided they wanted no longer to deal with the issue at all because of that. And there were also evidence that it wasn't just driven by politics, but big money that was funding the environmental organizations also made it kind of clear to them that they should tiptoe away from this issue.
Right. There was that incident with the Sierra Club in the 1990s when a fellow named Gelbaum donated $100 million. And all of a sudden, the Sierra Club seemed to have just done a 90-degree turn on population stabilization. And it was only years later that Gelbaum had admitted to an LA Times reporter that, yeah, he did kind of tell the Sierra Club that they wouldn't see a dime from him if they talked about immigration at all.
Yes, I noted him in the publication, and at the time, his donation was more than the entire annual budget of the organization. So one can't deny that had to have a tremendous influence.
It's always the money.
On that. And I think Polk was the Sierra Club
Was he?
president at the
Okay.
time. And he was, when he was in his younger years at least, was adamant about population growth as being an important issue to grasp. And it was strangely around this time that he started to sort of dodge that issue and went as far as even saying that people who brought it up were just a bunch of racists because he just did not want to go down that path. And it was just an excuse, if you will, to try to avoid the issue.
It's interesting in your book, and again, I've been living in Pennsylvania and Washington, D.C. area for about a year now, but I spent the last 20 years in Los Angeles, California. And you can really, in my view, every year it just seemed to get a little more difficult. It's almost like this downward spiral of life living there, where the commutes just got longer, the air got a little worse. There just seemed to be issues coming up with infrastructure, like, for instance, water mains breaking more frequently, repairs not being done to sidewalks or roadways or railways. And there were just so many demands on the government in going in a bunch of different directions. They couldn't focus on these key areas, like, something as simple as, improving the sewer system, which hadn't been improved since the 1930s. In your book, you compare two states in one of the chapters, California and Wyoming. And what you're trying to express there, it seems that in one place, there are a lot of environmental regulations, and in the other place, there are no environmental regulations. Yet when you look at the certain indicators of how well they're doing environmentally, such as aquatic wetland species at risk, high, moderate, low, pollutant loads discharged above permitted limits, toxics. Wyoming, which has no environmental regulations,
Very little.
very
Yes.
little, seems to be doing much better than California. What is that? Do you attribute that to population?
Certainly, Wyoming is the least populated state, and my intent here wasn't that population. You just keep your population low and you don't have to worry about environmental regulations. But the point of what that portion of the book was about was basically that you can have the strictest environmental regulations that you want, but if you continue to have unprecedented levels of increase in population, it's all going to act as a counterweight against it, and you're going to end up finding yourself trying to catch up. And California is a classic example of that. Though it is considered one of the most progressive states when it comes to environmental regulations, it's continually struggled to try to keep its environment to where it needs to be because of the growth that it continually has. It's doubled its population within 40 years. I mean, that's a tremendous. That has to have a tremendous impact, and it definitely has. And we like to think of the environmental impacts as just being okay, clean water. But as you said too, environmental impacts are also on quality of life. There wasn't that long ago in Southern California where an individual working class guy could afford his own home in the 1950s and so forth. And today that is no longer an opportunity, and that's driven by demand, limited amounts of land that can be habited in those regions.
Wow, it's interesting. Getting back to California, where am I correct when I say California per capita, they probably are the most energy efficient citizens of this country? Would that be correct?
Most certainly.
But every year the aggregate demand for energy goes up. And is that directly attributable to population?
Absolutely it is. And in fact, the Governor Brown had mentioned during the massive drought that they faced a couple of years back, that they had to start to reevaluate whether population growth was something that they needed to address. Naturally, they did not want to talk about what was the cause of that population growth, because that would have been a little bit more politically difficult for him to do so. But at the end of the day, that growth is driven not by native-born individuals. It's driven by populations abroad, and much of that without the okay, if you will, from the American government. It was through undocumented measures.
Any idea how many people would move to America if they could?
I had seen somewhere, at least, that 1 billion people would, but I don't know how realistic that statement was. But I think how can you not argue that any individual growing up in a very poor region of the world, why wouldn't they want to come to this country, specifically since we have been able to provide a great amount of opportunities and resources to such folks.
You had mentioned some of the forces that might be at work to want us to up our population. In your book, you had mentioned, for instance, and I'll read this from the book, remarks from this publication were included in an article in USA Today in February 2013. The piece stated that the slowdown is worrisome to many because of the growing gap between working-age populations that fund social programs and the elderly who rely on them. The imbalance between children and retirees is growing. The economic burden on a child born in 2015 will be nearly twice that of a child born in 1985, according to the USC study. That's University of Southern California study. Now, you can kind of see where maybe some economist is looking at this and saying, wow, we've got to make these numbers work. If we just bring in more people, then we'll be fine. But you don't agree with that.
It's just a very nearsighted view of things. I placed something in the book around that chapter about how China, for example, who had the one-child policy, its population was pretty much declining, and yet it's seen economic growth that is unimagined to what we've experienced in the last 20, 30 years. So I don't think population is necessarily the sole driver of economic growth. And I think that as we put more burden on our natural resources, it clearly won't be, because as things become too expensive for the average middle-class American to have because of demand, it's going to have some major impacts. And that's why we're already seeing in places like California, because of the tremendous growth that this region has had, it's had a very difficult impact economically to many of the people there.
So maybe the solution, maybe there is a quality versus quantity solution to this.
Sure. I even state somewhere in the book as well that I honestly believe that one of the reasons why you had the classic American dream with the white picket fence and the single-family home was because we had such a low, densely populated area where that could be realized for many working class folks. And unfortunately, that no longer is the case. So, as you pointed out, the quality of life, specifically for the underclass in America, it's not going to become any better as growth continues.
I want to read something to you. I did a blog. It was several months ago. I read an LA Times article, and the title of the article is "LA is the bad jobs capital of the U.S." And the article cited a recent report from the Los Angeles Economic Development Corporation stating that only 21% of Angelenos over the age of 25 have a high school diploma and nothing more. This is compared to 11% for the country as a whole. The article then went on to mention a silver lining, and that is 64% of the entry-level jobs in Los Angeles County don't require anything more than a high school diploma.
Wow.
And my thought was, when you had mentioned, when you had made that last comment on quality versus quantity, we were talking about that. I think of, like the German model, where they invest a lot into their employees in every way, from the corporations to the government. You don't see massive layoffs the way you do here. You see fair shared sacrifice across the board. But we seem to have this idea where, okay, we're just going to get all this quantity, but where is the earning power that's going to take care of all the elderly when they're older, economically speaking?
Okay, so probably to be fair, I'm not an expert really so much on the economic end of the
Right, because you are an
yes,
environmental
more
scientist.
on the environmental side of things. How would that impact the elderly as far as if we don't have, I guess, the population structure to support them? Well, a lot of the issues that we're facing when it comes to that already, as you pointed out, with Social Security and people talking about that, has nothing to do really with population growth. That was just bad fiscal responsibility in Washington, D.C. to not use the money that was coming in properly. And now they want to somehow suggest that, well, growth is the solution to that poor management aspect. So I don't necessarily buy that. And I think we also look at many Scandinavian countries that have a very, zero growth population, and yet they do not seem to have those same types of concerns as we do. Not saying that Europe doesn't have an aging population as we do here, but I again think that it's a very short-sighted view on just looking at it from current economics, and we have to understand that if we really truly want to preserve our nation economically for the future, sustainability has to be number one on that, because if there's no sustainability, then there's really not going to be any greater opportunities economically in the future.
So your book, and I really encourage our listeners to pick your book up, because you do, in a very heartful and understanding manner, lay out the implications of unbridled immigration. And because at your core, you're talking about population and population drivers. And the reality is, it's not the native population per se. It's immigration coming in that's really creating, raising the population.
Sure, and I try to point it out too in the book as well, that it isn't that immigration is bad. It isn't. It's uncontrolled immigration is bad.
Right, and I'm the son of an immigrant,
yes,
so
yes,
there you
yes,
go.
and that's to me is really what the issue is. It's not an issue that is immigration. It's an issue that we as a nation went from somewhat manageable growth per year at less than a million to now a population of the size of Philadelphia each year.
Right.
So that really is what the problem is. Small, manageable sense of immigration. Absolutely, we as a nation, I'm sure, can find means to maintain population stability and environmental sustainability through that measure. So nowhere do I advocate that immigration should be something that we need to eliminate. It just needs to be responsible, and that's kind of what the point is. As you mentioned, that we just have experienced this massive growth, much greater even than at the time period of Ellis Island, which was considered the Great Migration to America.
So, Paul, in chapter 12 of your book, there's a quote that starts the chapter. It's from President Clinton's Population and Consumption Task Force. Now, it's 1996, so the numbers here aren't reflective of current, but certainly the alarm being indicated here is current to what we're talking about.
Correct.
And the quote is this: 1/3 of U.S. population growth comes from legal and illegal immigration, now at an all-time high. This is a sensitive issue, but reducing immigration levels is a necessary part of population stabilization and the drive towards sustainability. I mean, there in 1996, that's the Clinton administration. He's saying we do need to reduce immigration for environmental reasons.
It appears so, and it's amazing how somehow we don't like to look at that today.
And in this same chapter, you list 5 arguments that
Opponents.
that oppose your views and my views on the subject. And I think for our audience, I'd like to read those
Sure.
and just have you opine on them. Okay, the first, population growth is principally a global challenge and should be solved at the global level. Number 2, greater attention should be given to mitigating America's consumption and lifestyle habits, since they are of much greater concern to the environmental degradation. 3, immigrants tend to live greener lives than native-born Americans and therefore would have limited impression on the nation's environment. Number 4, America's foreign policy is responsible since it has a profound effect on the economic, social, and environmental conditions of immigrants in their native lands. Number 5, and the last one, attempts to use the connection between immigration and the environment treats immigrants as scapegoats for America's environmental problems. Okay, so those are the arguments against us that are out there, Paul, and frankly, I've heard them all over the years.
Yes, I'll take them each individually here. The global issue, the global level only. Yes, is population growth a global issue? No doubt of that. But that doesn't mean that it can't be localized or regionalized or nationalized. I live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, for example, and you look at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Chesapeake Bay Program, the 2 largest groups that are advocates of the Bay, each have an entire segment of their websites dedicated to how population growth has had a tremendous degradation on the Chesapeake Bay. That's not growth that's being driven.
And that's the watershed
Yes.
for much of the middle states, the water from the middle states.
Absolutely, and that's growth that is not resulted from people in Germany or growth that are from people in Europe or wherever. It's from
Growth right here,
right
locally.
here in America. So that whole argument, I feel, is just a distraction from population growth being a domestic issue as well. When we look at consumption, clearly we as a nation have a major consumption issue. There's no doubt of that.
And I like to refer people to it was Oregon State University several years ago, 2 statisticians, Murtaugh and Schlacks, I believe their names were. They came up with relative carbon footprints, and they put the U.S. at 20. And Mexico was at like 3.4.
Yes.
And,
So does it make sense to have more Americans then?
no,
Exactly.
exactly. If you
Exactly.
believe, if like me, you believe in anthropogenic climate change, it doesn't make a lot of sense to add more people to where the consumption is the highest.
Yes. And beyond that, too, that argument would be correct if population wasn't a factor in consumption. Think about what consumption really is based on, and it really is based on population. The more people we have, the more toilets that you're going to need, the more garbage that you're going to have to dispose of, the more transportation methods you're going to have, and that's all consumption based. So if we had our population what it was in 1950 and had our consumption rates as they are today, overall consumption would have been half of what it is today because
Correct.
of growth.
I don't think you can drive enough Priuses or recycle enough or put in enough CFL bulbs, to mitigate.
Absolutely, and I'm not at all saying that consumption isn't something that we don't address. We need to, and it is a major factor for sustainability. But population growth is married to consumption. It's part of that as far as the overall impact. They shouldn't be split out, and I think it's just an excuse to just say, oh well, consumption is the problem here. And when we look at other countries that they like to compare us against when it comes to consumption, do we really want to live in huts with no electricity, with no running water, so that our consumption rates are very low? No, we'd like to see a world where people have a little bit more so that they can live a better life, but we should find means to do that in a more responsible manner. So I guess on the third point that you mentioned is immigrants live greener lives. There's probably no doubt in my mind that statement is true, but how temporarily of a statement is that? I mean,
my experience living in Los Angeles, it's only a year or two before someone purchases the SUV.
Sure.
And
the reality is we're all children of immigrants in that regard. So the point is that they're eventually going to adapt their lifestyles with anyone else in a country. So how's that?
They'll be deprived.
Exactly. And so how is that even a valid argument? Yet it is one that I have seen time and time again. The fourth one, as far as America's oppressive policies abroad, it depends on where you are at, from what part of the economic, imperialistic views that you have on America. But I again think it's somewhat of a scapegoat. I mean, yes, America hasn't always been the best nation to others at times, but I think overall we have tried to do a little bit better to make the world a little bit better than other superpowers in the past. And clearly,
but ultimately, it isn't. We're not addressing the problem.
Yes, exactly. It's a distraction.
It is a distraction. And it's used as a distraction.
And that's the entire point of that entire argument there. And the last one with the scapegoats is exactly the same thing too. It is an attempt to deviate from the issue of population growth by saying that if anyone wants to talk about it, they're racist. Because as I point out in my book, this issue isn't about immigration to me. It's about mass growth resulting from the drivers of growth. And if that driver of growth is fertility, then I'm here to talk about that. But right now in America today, that driver is immigration. And it isn't immigration itself, it's just the mass immigration that we experience today because of poor policy decisions in Washington.
Speaking of Washington, we are in this odd place right now. Certain events have come together, stars seem to be aligning, where we have in office a president that seems to have little regard for the environment. He's essentially, a real estate salesman.
Sure.
But he's very good on this issue of wanting to bridle immigration. Sure. Now, if you were to spend 5 minutes in front of President Trump, what would you say to him, Paul?
Well, I most certainly wouldn't want him to use the environment as an excuse to reach his immigration goals. But for my own selfish opinion, because of my care for the environment as an environmental scientist, I most certainly would hope that he can find measures to utilize population stability, whether his intentions are for environmental protection or not. It doesn't really matter as much to me. What matters to me is that we achieve population stability, because at the end of the day, if we don't achieve that, we won't have environmental sustainability, and it is an issue that needs to seriously be addressed. So I guess if I had a conversation with the president, I would let him know that I think that it would do well if he started to maybe direct the EPA to have a population growth program that would look at the impacts of population to America's environment, what that is per person, perhaps work with the Department of Homeland Security to figure out what levels of immigration that would be that could occur in this country that could be done at a responsible level. Those are the types of things that I would talk to the president about. So although we may have different reasons for why we want to limit immigration, mine being more for environmental protection, his being more for his concerns with economic and social aspects, the end result could still be the same. And so I do hope that we can, I would be able to encourage him to utilize or take the environmental aspects of this issue into consideration.
Wow. I hope you get that 5 minutes in front of you.
So do I. So do I.
Well, Paul, we're coming up on the end of our time
Sure.
here today. Is there anything that you would like to, that I haven't touched on, that you think would be important for our audience to take away from this podcast?
Well, I guess overall, the intention of the book that I wrote was not just to show the science behind it, which is pretty much in the first segment of the entire book, but it was also to show how politics has made a major impact on this issue and has really prevented it from being really something that we discuss. And that's kind of where the name of it comes from, Pandora's Green Box, meaning that there's been a key on it, that we don't want to talk about it because we're concerned, because of the politics behind it. And so my hope is that this book will bring more people aware of exactly what the politics is. And my bigger hope is, as we just discussed too, is that somehow there's a better way that we can reach the administration to show them, hey, this is an avenue that we can take to help protect the environment, and it kind of aligns already with his policies that he wants to see with immigration. So I think although his actions may not necessarily look at it specifically for environmental purposes, the end result would result to that.
Hey, and maybe the loss of a mansion to a megastorm might be a wake-up call.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, well, Paul, I really want to thank you for coming down here.
Thank you, Kevin.
And talking with us today. This was fantastic. I wish you the best of luck. And again, I strongly encourage our listeners to go out, get your book, Pandora's Green Box.
Yes.
And I want to thank everyone for taking the time to, out of your busy days, to listen to us here at Progressives for Immigration Reform.
Right.
Take care.
Yes, thank you, Kevin. And they can visit for more
Oh,
information.
yes, that's right. How to find you, Paul. Yes.
I have a website, www.pandorasgreenbox.com. And even if you're not interested in purchasing the book, there's some quotes there that might be of some interest and some background or organizations that you might want to find more information about. So hopefully you visit. All right, thank you, guys.